Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Digital Leaders Show, where each week we discuss key issues and news at the intersection of business, technology, and the humanities in hopes of making you a better digital leader. This week, we're discussing various headlines for digital leaders from the world of enterprise technology. We're live each Wednesday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. The audio recording is available on major podcast platforms. And don't forget to check us out at DEInetwork.com for executive coaching, industry briefings, and peer-to-peer research. I'm Dan Goodstein. I head up Digital Enterprise Institute, as well as our sister organization, the Institute for Robotic Process Automation and Artificial Intelligence. We're a professional association and peer-to-peer research network providing education, networking, and advice to over 130,000 members globally, all around automation, enterprise AI, and digital transformation. My co-host, as always, is Carlos Alvarenga. He's a researcher, writer, educator at the University of Maryland in Georgetown, and former advisor from EY and Accenture. Carlos, good afternoon.
And good to be back.
So you just got back from Europe, yes?
I did a week in Austria and Germany. So we landed yesterday in the afternoon. Nice to be back home.
What was there other than you telling me that nobody knows that anything's happening with AI over there?
Apparently AI wasn't even in the top. It was nice to get a week without any single chat GPT story or OpenAI or anything like that. Paris is burning, and the big news in the UK was this sort of controversy over Partygate with Boris Johnson. But mostly I think the headlines were sort of dominated by the Credit Suisse issue, right? And the question of another bank kind of on the brink, and it looks like it's the deal was made with UBS, and now the exit has begun as bankers who feel like they won't have a place at UBS are looking for work someplace else. So the fallout of the Fed and interest rates continues to sort of migrate over to there. So that was sort of the big news of the week.
Yeah, and today's an interesting day. The Fed's meeting today about interest rates, so we shall see what. I don't think they've announced anything yet, Carlos, but I've been back to back all morning.
No, it looks like the market's kind of pricing in a 0.25 rate increase, and maybe words to the effect of the pause is going to come. We see the fallout, right, with SVB and everything else, and once banks start falling, the market seems to think that's going to be enough to get the Fed to sort of dial it back, if not actually a pause. It would be a real shock if they said we're going to pause all rates, because I think the market would then take off on that. But everyone's expecting a small increase, and then kind of words to kind of calm the market to suggest that, okay, we're probably at the end of this cycle, given that the banks are starting to fall. We have banks starting to fail now. At this point, the impact on the economy is being seen because of what's happened over the course of the last year or two. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we had a great show last week. It was a little bit impromptu based on the news, with Silicon Valley Bank, but we had a fintech expert, Patrick Leonard, on, who kind of broke down, his views on what was happening and where technology, maybe should have been able to help or could help going forward. But I will say, he kind of calmed me down on the hype of the potential hype of the bank crisis thing. And then I don't know, the last week I'm kind of back to where I was before about, I think this thing is a little bit more fragile than people realize.
That's what I said last week. I think there's more here than what we see on the surface, right? And as these things go, they tend to unfold over weeks, not hours. So there might be, looking back over what happened last time, right, 10 years ago, so much of what's going on was happening behind closed doors as really bad outcomes are trying to be avoided by people. So there might be a lot of things that we just don't know about that are taking place trying to save someone from making it into the headlines at this point, right? Which is what we all kind of hope happens. Don't want this to become an even bigger issue than it is. But I suspect it's not just 3 or 4 banks, right? If there's a Credit Suisse and FEB, and there are probably a few others that are on the brink, or at least having those kind of conversations to avoid getting to the brink at this point. I can't imagine it's just what we've seen so far in the news.
Yeah. And it seems like a lot of the news, at least the thread that I saw in looking at the news over the last 24 hours was, very much around regulation, right? So you have the CEO of TikTok is going to be testifying before Congress this week. I think it's I don't know if it's today or tomorrow. And there's also a ruling expected on the crypto lawsuit, the SEC versus Ripple. They're expecting today to have some results of that, which is really a huge precedent for the crypto industry about, whether crypto is going to be considered a security and kind of governed or regulated by the SEC. And, I know that lawsuit started 2 years ago, but the timing of that right after the crypto, right after the Silicon Valley bank crash is very, very interesting.
Right. We also have this California developments there, right? With California, like the appeal sort of landing on the side of Lyft and Uber and returning the idea that these are the drivers and such are independent contractors, right? I don't think this one is over yet either, but for the moment, it looks like the gig economy companies have won, and that the workers will continue to be treated as contractors, right? Which is what the companies have always asked for.
What's your opinion on that, Carlos? I don't think we've talked a lot about the gig economy. I don't know if we've talked specifically about whether or not the classifications are relevant.
My take is that I think we're missing a term in the United States, and it existing in other countries, and that is what's termed a dependent contractor. So we have here employee or contractor, right? But in other places they have three terms. So we have employee, you've got independent contractor, and you've got a dependent contractor. Difference being that an independent contractor is truly independent. If one company doesn't want to hire you tomorrow, you're going to be fine. You have a multiplicity of clients, a portfolio of clients, so you don't depend on any one client, right, or company for your livelihood. When there is some threshold, let's say it's 65% of your work, your income comes from one company, then you are a dependent contractor, right? Your livelihood depends on one entity, and so some set of rights is given to you once you cross that threshold. And I think that, to me, it seems the solid monic, the smart choice. And the reality is that if you really are a gig worker and you get your income from 25 different sources, great, you're an independent contractor. But if 80% of your income comes from DoorDash or Uber, then to me, then you should be probably an employee, but at the very least, a dependent contractor, right? Which is a state we just don't have here. I'd seen the term sort of float around in California for a while in some of the discussions there, but it hasn't become something that sort of hit the common lingo. So I think they were just missing this third state, which is something in between, right? A fully independent contractor and an employee.
Yeah, I've had this discussion, in the past around, more traditional conversation around, employees versus contractors. Just because we're very virtual as an organization, have had people, across the states and elsewhere working for us. And at one point, at least the Department of Labor here, used to classify it as whether or not you had other clients. I don't know if they specified, what percentage of your income, but it was whether you had other clients, whether or not you were under the direct direction of a particular person, meaning they set your hours and what you did when. And I think there may have been a third criteria, but I think the issue now, whether it's a remote worker or an Uber or a Lyft driver, is that they do have multiple gigs, right? I mean, it's not a scenario where if you drive, I don't think, most people, what I've seen when I'm in those cars is, they got Uber running on one phone, they've got Lyft running on the other phone. Now you have DoorDash delivery stuff that they're maybe doing, in between. And I've even been in cars where they're doing like conference calls for some other business gig that they've got on the side while they're driving you around. And so, to me, that doesn't meet the definition of an employee.
Right, but that might be because we don't have the third state.
Right.
Right. So if somebody said, "Hey, listen, if you cross 65% of your hours on Uber, that's going to give you some kind of benefit," then maybe the drivers would. All of a sudden, you would make the effort, right, to cross that threshold with one of the companies. Right now, there's no incentive for you not to diversify because there's no benefit. It's a binary system, right? You either work at Uber or you don't, and then the drivers do not. And so, what difference does it make whether I'm running three different apps at the same time? If we were to create this third state, right, this intermediate state, then then we might not see what you're seeing today. Right now, there's no reason why you wouldn't kind of go down.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I think, especially in this world, because you and I have talked also about what happens to IP in this environment when you're working from home and stuff. I think the reality is that the paradigm has shifted, and I think that it's very difficult to unless you have an exclusivity contract with your employer where you can't work for a competitor or something. I think it's very difficult for that employer to direct you when you're working remotely and you're working from home. It used to be you walked into an office and unless they walked in on you playing video games or doing something else, they kind of knew what you were doing. In fact, there was software, controversial software in people's computers that were limiting what they could do and monitoring what they could do. So you couldn't do those things at work. Now, do the employers really know what their employees are doing at home? I mean, to the extent that you saw these videos on YouTube and Twitter and stuff where people had rigged up little machines to make their mouse move so that they would be seen as active on Teams. I don't think you can really direct them anymore in that.
Well, there's an answer to that, right? There's an article on HBR.com right now that says that remote workers are 32% more likely to fear layoffs, as the word layoff has come back to the lexicon right in the last 6 months or so. And especially in the tech sector, you see tens of thousands of layoffs. As one would expect, the ones who were not in the office, the ones who are remote, the ones who took that option and sort of went all in on being out of the office are now the ones that are the most afraid of when the cuts come, because there's a human element to that, right? The reality is, if you are someone who's just on Zoom and there isn't that human to human interaction when you get inside the office, then certainly it's just that one more step that it makes it easier for someone to cut you out of the equation. And not that it was hard to begin with in this country, but right, there was still that human element of, well, do I like this person? Do I like being around them? Do I work with them? If it's just I have 15 Zoom screens and 6 have to go, then again, how much different is that from the old contractor days, right? Outsourcing days where you say, look, I just need 3 less FTEs, and that's just
yeah. So maybe employees are redefined as people that go into the office versus people that are working from home. If you work from home or you work in your car, you're by definition a consultant. Maybe that's the line. But I think it's and the other part of it, which I'm not sure if this is addressed in the lawsuit or not, but I think we've talked about in the past, which is the classification of the Ubers and Lyfts of the world as transportation companies versus technology companies, and should they be subject to the same regulations as your local taxi company is?
But I want to miss that point, because I joke that as time goes on, the working world looks more and more like consulting. When I was an associate, right, we worked remotely. We didn't have an office. Maybe you were there on a Friday.
That's true.
You were somewhere else, where you were doing conference calls, sometimes video calls. It was very flat. It was task oriented. Authority was given sort of by knowledge, right? And you had to work virtually on a global level from the very beginning. And it's interesting how, to your point, right, especially post COVID, a lot of workplaces look like PwC did, circa 1995.
Yeah.
So the world kind of continues to move that direction. I think you're right. There is a big difference between the traditional co-located employee and what it does to someone psychologically to be with somebody every single day, and then the idea of, look, this is somebody who's somewhere. I don't really know where they are on any given day. I think this is a real issue. And I think there's something also, one other point to mention is that just the psychology, right? It's especially in America, because I think in this country, we're so defined by what we do, which is not the same in other places, right? Especially in places like South America, people don't ask you what you do for a living the first time.
Amazing, right?
What they meet you, right? It's almost a taboo subject sometimes. And here in the U.S.,
the first question you get: what's your name? What do you do?
What do you do? Right. That is the great American opening question. And it's and we go back to, are you an employee? You're not an employee. So there's also that psychological mention of, do I work for you or do I not work for you? And if I don't, then what am I?
Nil is asking, what's our take on a hybrid option? I'm a big fan of the hybrid option. I actually think that's the only thing that glues a virtual remote person to the organization, any semblance of, employer loyalty. And I do think that, there's a combination. I mean, to the extent that people are, now looking to other social circles to fulfill that interaction that they maybe not getting from work. I think it's also an opportunity to, change the way people work, in the sense that, we've all been in jobs where, all we do is, sit in back-to-back meetings all day. And then, I wonder, how do we even get any work done? Right. So I think the hybrid option is, if you're in the office a few days for meetings and collaboration, but then, you're left alone the other days to actually get some deep work done. And then you are an employee, maybe, in the sense, because you're physically at the office, you're interacting with other people, you feel like you're part of the team, and it's really the collaboration that's tough to do virtually.
My sense is the hybrid option works if the company culture is built around it. And I mentioned consulting, right? And consulting from always operated this way. And so because it understood that you weren't going to see this person physically in the office, maybe, like I said, on a Friday, right, when everybody kind of comes back in and we spend dinner together, the systems, the processes, the way we promoted people, right, compensated them, was built from the ground up to work that way. But I've also been in places where that's not the culture, where people put in, impromptu meetings, schedule stuff, right, on a moment's notice. And so while they have hybrid options, the leadership doesn't operate in a hybrid way. And so you're penalized if you are in that hybrid system that particular day. So just saying we do a hybrid, but not rejigging management, right, and compensation and promotions and evaluations with a hybrid model in place, it's a recipe for failure. Because what's going to happen is the people who happen to not be in the office that day when things that are important happen are penalized for having taken the hybrid option. So just saying we have hybrid without rethinking leadership and management to support it, I think it's a recipe for a failure. And I think that, I mean, I've seen it, right? It's if you're going to be hybrid, there's a lot of work that goes along with managing in a hybrid way, and it can be done, and it can be done well. But just because you have a hybrid policy doesn't mean that people who work who take that option, right, are going to be treated fairly. In fact, probably that's not going to be the case if the company continues to manage as if we were all located in the same place.
So, and then back to the other point, which is that, the regulation of the industries. I'm very back and forth. Well, maybe not back and forth. I think I'm very half and half on, regulation. I want to talk to you about, some of the conversations this week around, regulating AI and the regulating of TikTok and crypto and things. But this is one example where I'm not sure the regulation is beneficial, as it relates to the Ubers and Lyfts. I think it's just, the government trying to get their piece and stymieing, innovation and technology, right? I mean, if people don't want to, use Uber or Lyft or, the other stuff, then just don't use it. Why does the government have to get involved and say, oh no, you're a transportation company, you have to look like all the other transportation companies? I just think it slows innovation.
Well, this is the long history of labor versus management, right? And historically, what labor got from management was not obtained because management suddenly decided to be very nice and give you a dental plan or to give you vacations. The history of the labor movement, especially in the US, is a pretty rough one, right? What people got, and I'm going back 100, 150 years, right? What they got through collective action, they got through striking, they got through a lot of different things. And we've talked before about how the rise of the college educated union, right, member, which is another thing that's happening today, at places like Starbucks and Amazon, right, is another phenomenon. It's just the matter of do the how in this model, right? Is there any collective action that workers can take? Now, what we do know is that there is, despite the fact that it looks like you couldn't, because there are apps that a lot of drivers use, which are used as almost counter apps, right? There was a great article about this about a year or two ago. The New York Times had about all the various apps that you can download if you're an Uber driver to help you figure out how to maximize your revenue, right, or understand, right, what's happening with the algorithm. But this the idea that there's no regulation at all. Capitalism has a history of when there's no regulation, right? The weakest element in the system gets abused, right? That's just a matter of fact over history. So, is that the case here? The academic studies seem to suggest that in some cases it is, but it's not a clear cut case. To your point, if you read the research, right, it is really a combination of things. Some people are very very happy with the gig economy as it is. They don't want it to change, right? I'm talking about people who are workers. They like exactly the flexibility, and maybe it's such a thing that it's so big now and human beings are so complicated that we're going to find everything, right, Dan? You're going to
Yeah, yeah.
who
I,
love
I don't think it's. I think it's just
right?
it's a choice, right? It's a choice of you don't like it, go get a job somewhere else. This is not 1930s America where you live in a town and there's one industry and one company, one employer, and you have to work for that factory and it's really unsafe. I mean, if you don't like Uber, go to Lyft. If you don't like Lyft, find the next one. If you don't like that one, go. There's 1,000 food and beverage companies hiring right now. I just think there's a bit of people complaining that they don't like it, but they don't really want to do the alternative. So I just don't think the government should get involved on that one. The other one this week is today's a very very big day for crypto, right? So the other government regulation question this week is should the government be regulating crypto? And we knew this was coming. And this lawsuit's been going on for 2 years. But like I said, the timing of this after the banking crash is very interesting.
Yeah, the other thing I've been reading are articles that are asking the question: should the FDIC just come out and say that all deposits are insured? That's effectively what you did 2 weeks ago. So what's going to happen the next time? Aren't you really implying, right, by the action that we're taking relative to SCB, that all depositors are protected? And if that's the case, then why not say so? And if that's not the case, then what makes SVB special, right? It's because this goes back to the question we had this week, which is okay. So what are the rules then? When are my deposits over 250K protected? Is it when you feel like it, FDIC? Is that the way it's supposed to be from now on? So yeah, the regulatory issues around crypto, around what happened last week with banking security, are really interesting. And crypto, I my take is it's gonna be regulated, right? And that's the way it's gonna go. I don't think it's, especially in this current environment, that we're gonna get is, well, do whatever you want, whatever happens happens. It doesn't work that way. I just
Yeah,
can't.
I have mixed emotions about it. Part of me feels like again it stymies innovation, and part of the benefit of it is that it's decentralized. So if people are willing to take the risk, then they should theoretically get the reward. There's nothing stopping you from investing in a company, putting seed funding into a company and losing that money. Where I do see the benefit is, I don't know that everybody understands the risk that they're getting into. So maybe it's more about, the advertising and the promotion of this, and that also happened supposedly with SVB, where they were promoting. I think you may have even mentioned this on our last show, or maybe it was Patrick. They were promoting the bank as and maybe even strong arming certain organizations that this was the bank of Silicon Valley, that if you wanted to be in the startup community, if you wanted to be in the tech community, this is where you had to put your money. You shouldn't put it in other places and things. So maybe the answer is the government gets involved in, how these things are marketed and promoted to the marketplace, in opposed to, just trying to take their piece. Just
I
like
think crypto sealed their fate when they went retail, right? And if you look at SEC and how they think, they make a distinction between the people, what they would call a sophisticated investor and the average person, right? And so, if you ever involved in a venture effort, there's it's a paper people have to sign if they're going to be invest in a VC situation where it says, look, I'm a sophisticated investor. I made over so much money last year. This isn't going to bankrupt me. And you sign that paper, and then you can invest in a startup, right? Why? Because the government says it's a difference if you're relatively well off, you know what you're doing, and you're willing to lose 100K or whatever it is in a startup. That's very different from somebody who's putting, maybe it could be a big amount of their savings into this startup situation, right? Because they shouldn't be allowed to do this. And I think when crypto said, you're Joe Blow watching the Super Bowl, come buy some right Bitcoin, that's when the deal was done. I mean, that sealed their fate. Because what happens then is, if something really does blow up later, then the SEC looks bad for not having taken any action. If they had said crypto is only for people who make, well, let's pick a number, right? You make $1 million a year, you have a net worth of 10 million, and you have to buy it through special channels, right? And it's not for everybody. And if you lose all your money, fine, then that's one thing. It's just like owning shares, right? We've got 10Ks and reports, right? You could say, well, listen, you buy stock in Coke, that's your problem if Coca-Cola goes bankrupt tomorrow. But that's not how it works, right? Because there are a lot of mom and pop people who buy um, equities. And I think once they said, right, you could be 18 and start buying crypto, then at that point, that's when they had, at that moment, it's when they set themselves to be regulated years down the road.
And maybe this legitimizes it, right? Maybe this makes it, maybe it's good for crypto in the sense that, now it's something that is going to, kind of endorsed, by the government, and says, hey, we're going to protect you just like we did for this bank. We're going to protect you against, fraud. And so there, this article in Wired talks about something called the Howey test, where they, the definition for the SEC's involvement is, that it's an investment in money in a common enterprise with a reasonable expectation of profits derived from the effort of others. And I think they may be even saying kind of what you're saying, which is that, in some cases, crypto does not meet that definition. But in the case of Ripple and this coin called XRP, where they were marketing it a certain way, now it is a common enterprise, whereas before it wasn't a common enterprise. And then you look at FTX and you say, hey, this is what we need to avoid, right?
Right. I think it comes down to that. If your clients, if you've got a crypto business that's selling to hedge funds, right, investment banks, and people who have heavy duty expertise, right, in this space, that's one thing. But when it's retail financial services, I cannot imagine that the SEC is going to say this is not our problem, right? It is. Once the average quote unquote consumer is targeted, then at that point, that's the case. Now, the other thing that ask yourself, right, is, well, okay, if we regulate, and does that mean also the government is now taking on some sort of backstop risk, right, or liability by regulating? So that's the other interesting question, right? Does FDIC 5 years from now extend into crypto positions, which it doesn't today, right? Today it's just savings. So, and checking, obviously. So yeah, look, I think it comes down to this issue, right? Once you become a retail product that the average consumer, I think it's true, the risk then equation flips, because if something goes really bad and the SEC gets called in front of Congress and gets asked, why didn't you do anything about this? It's not going to look good to say, oh, well, look, it's none of our business, right? What happens to crypto? We're not going to say that.
So so this is kind of financial risk. Let's talk about cybersecurity risk. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, I guess it's not probably a big surprise what's happening. I still wonder why these congressional hearings ever really happen, because I think most of them, if you watch them, are less about getting questions answered and more about the politicians just giving their opinions at the person who's testifying. But what's I know you're a big, when you and I have debates, I tend to lean more towards let technology evolve, and you tend to lean more towards privacy. I know you're not a big fan of TikTok, but what's your sense of what
I was struck
do
by,
with this?
again, it got sent to culture, right? Being in Europe for the last week, every time you went to a website, you get a whole page you have to read, and you get to choose which cookies do you have. Do you understand their privacy? You cannot do anything online without at least being asked to pause and consider the implications on your own personal privacy of using this site. That doesn't happen here. Here, it's a free for all. So I really believe that, right? Again, it goes back to what we talked before, that the American culture has been to trade privacy away for convenience. It's an asymmetrical trade. I think it's the wrong trade, but we vote with our downloads, and the American consumer just doesn't care. I think for them, you could tell people, look, you could tell them that China is watching everything you're doing on TikTok. I maybe 1% of TikTok users would log off. Who knows, right? But I don't think, even if the worst case scenario would happen, that all of a sudden there'd be an excess in the platform for whatever reason, whatever it is value that TikTok brings to people, it surpasses any concerns they have over privacy, and that's generally been the case in this country.
Yeah, I think the target demo for TikTok, it doesn't care. And so I think it's more of a generational thing than people talk about. I can even tell you in my own personal conversations, not entirely generational, but it's largely generational where, and I know more than the average person. I'm not an expert, but I know more than the average person what the potential privacy issues are. And I continue to choose, the things that I choose where, my older, parents' generation, in-laws, things, they were not willing to take on that convenience in exchange for privacy. But I just wonder, like in Europe, Europe's an interesting question. Maybe we should get some stats for a future show. On one hand, Europe has been ahead of the US in a lot of emerging technology adoption. But I'd got to think that that regulation, the GDPR and other, has slowed things down, and I don't know if it's worked. I mean, if you go to any website that operates in Europe, do you read those things? Because they're so complicated about the cookies. They're so complicated. I just say yes and I ignore it anyway. So it's like the end user license agreements in the US. Technically, before you install software, they get, Apple gives you 30 probably 300 pages of legalese that nobody actually reads anyway. So is it kind of the same thing?
No, I think what happens in Europe, from what I've read, is that it's on a daily basis. There's not much difference, right? Effectively, however, if there's a problem, right, then the recourse you have in Europe is infinite. It's just orders of magnitude better than it is in the United States. Here, you're on your own, right? But in Europe, you have a legal framework that supports you if you were to get into a dispute with YouTube or Facebook, whoever it is, right, tomorrow, you'd have some legal basis to at least have that conversation with the company that has your data. Here, good luck, right? You're not going to have, there's no legal support for a US citizen, I don't think, who suddenly decides, look, I want to get my data back, right? I want my information back from
That's
companies
fair. That's
you're
fair.
seeing. I think in Europe you do. We had this famous right to be forgotten thing, right? Which is beginning all this stuff back in Spain, where the person, I think though it all goes back to this guy who was in Spain who had a bankruptcy, and the bankruptcy appeared when somebody Googled him, and that began that was, if I remember correctly, right, that was the origin that eventually led to GDPR many years later. So there is it's I think it's a nice thing that if you happen to get into a big fight with Google over your information, that you've got the law on your side, even though that's probably not going to happen, because here you have nothing, right? When you think,
That's a good point. The recourse is a good point. I just, and the TikTok thing, I don't really get the obsession with regulating TikTok. And by the way, I'm not saying that TikTok is good. I've actually read a lot of studies. We've talked a lot about social media in general, about how it's changing society and the way we get information. And there's a whole list of negatives that are a different conversation for a different day. But particular to the cybersecurity concerns, I just don't get the obsession with TikTok. I mean, you have Chinese manufacturer. I think it's all political. You have Chinese manufacturers that are, making hardware for iPhones. You have Chinese manufacturers, one of the largest providers of commercial cameras and surveillance equipment that's used by government agencies and police departments across the US is
right,
a Chinese company, right? And if you don't care about a Chinese company that does surveillance technology, why do you care about a Chinese company that's got videos of people dancing on it, that the target demographic is people that can't even vote and don't largely own businesses or have a lot of money?
the world's biggest drone maker, right, is the Chinese company. I think that there is this, and we've had this history here where we suddenly feel that we're in a geopolitical, right, race with somebody, then suddenly things begin to appear as targets, right, which are really proxies, right? They don't. It's not the company per se. It's just representative of our fear of country A, B, or C. You can go back and look at Japan had its moment, right, when people were concerned. Look, the Japanese are buying everything, right? So then that became an issue. The Russians at one point, even maybe now again, right? China suddenly has become the big competitor to the United States. And so I think a lot of political, agents look for something that demonstrates simply that we're concerned about China. We get it. You're worried about them. We are worried about them. What can we pick that shows how worried we are? Right? It isn't the people who make cameras for police departments. Instead, it's going to be TikTok because everybody has it on their phone. So if I told you I'm attacking the company that makes recording equipment for police stations, you're not going to care. But if I say I'm holding hearings and I'm bringing in the CEO of TikTok, that's going to play a lot better in the news to an audience that may be worried in a general sort of way, right, about China. And
And I
by the
think it's a bad
way,
precedent. It's a bad precedent. You can't talk about capitalism and all these great things that make America unique, and then say, oh, we're not gonna allow our citizens to use an app that is partially owned by Chinese entities. I mean, I think it's just a bad precedent to set.
you don't think there's any limit where you say, okay, this is a special case because it happens to be our number one geopolitical adversary, and I use the word adversary correctly, I think.
Maybe, but I think it's the least security priority of all the other things that we've mentioned, right? So after you take down all the surveillance cameras and the iPhones and the planes that they build and all that other stuff, then we can worry about what 19-year-olds are doing on a social media app. But I think it's just the least priority for them to be going after, and this is kind of back to the whole, social media conversation. Like I said, I think all the social media platforms need better regulation and content moderation, or maybe a third. We recommended a couple months ago, a third party that verifies
Yeah.
where information comes from and how things are labeled in social media. I think social media as a whole is inevitable, but also problematic. I don't think that TikTok, though, represents a larger risk than
Yeah, we had
Facebook, Instagram, or the surveillance cameras that we talked about.
well, we had the Huawei a couple of years ago,
Right.
right?
Right.
So we were in the infrastructure side of things when we had the Huawei question, right? And then now we're in the retail side of things with the TikTok question. There'll be something else after TikTok, right? Because China is innovating at such a rapid pace that I'm sure there'll be something else that'll come along for them in the next 5 years, and that will suddenly become the number one thing that people here are worried about, right? They're not going anywhere when it comes
It's
to
just the
TikTok.
priorities are, I think it's a combination of politicians not really understanding this stuff and just the priorities being screwed up. The other thing in the time that we have is, there's been more and more conversations as the generative AI world kind of, heats up. Google is officially rolling out Bard. I'm on the wait list, so hopefully I'll get to play with it and talk about it next week. And there's some concern coming out about just the technology behind Chat GPT, is coming out, from other copycats, other organizations that, are doing similar things, and maybe don't have the same, societal or corporate restrictions that Google and Open AI and Microsoft may have, which is concerning people, right? Because it's already a concern about where these things pull their information from. When you ask it a question and you just assume that the answer is correct and validated and credible, which we've talked a lot about on this show, at least you think, hey, maybe I trust Microsoft or I trust Google. But now if there's copycats out there, you don't know what their ulterior motives are. You don't know if they're Chinese owned. I'd be more concerned about this. I'd be more concerned about a Chinese owned Chat GPT than I am about TikTok, because that's where all of a sudden people start sharing information and getting information back that they take as truth. And there's no regulation of this at all.
Well, we go back to the ability to filter information, right? Like you, I started as a journalist. So the old model of editorial, right, of being an editor was that you removed content, right? So somebody had, you filed a story, they took your 10-page story, made it 4, and that's what kind of got published. Now editorial is really more like it's filtering. It's what can I trust in this? And I think this is where the gap is right now. I had a conversation a while ago with the head of a communications school here in Washington, and we chatted about this need to develop a better sense of filtering, right? And which we don't have it because we didn't really need it kind of evolutionarily because institutions filter for us, right? And we've been in this sort of 50-year or 5-decade sort of transformation from institutional filtering, right? That there were three networks, quote unquote. You trusted the Times, or you trusted ABC or CBS, whatever it was, and they kept almost everything out and let only a small amount of information come through. To now, as Jason mentioned, we had Jason on about History Disrupted, that now everything gets through. And so the task of deciding what is a credible source, right? And what can I believe? It was bad enough as it before. After this, right, like you said, who knows? And as the deep fakes, the visual video, we talked about this before, and I mentioned it in my book. Once we get to the point where the last trustable thing, more or less, for the average person has been video, right? And we're now at the cusp of the ability to make a video that shows anyone doing kind of anything. And
Yeah, there's
that,
videos of Trump getting arrested yesterday. Deep fakes of Trump getting arrested
right.
yesterday.
So at that
It was a
point,
trending topic on Twitter, even though it was fake.
right. So now you have what you think is visual evidence, and there's something so profoundly, it's sort of primal in us that we see it and we believe it. Right? To see is to believe. The old saying goes. When you cannot believe anything, what you hear could be fake, what you see could be fake, right? What you read could be fake. Then we're in a whole, evolutionarily speaking, right? We're in a very strange place where three or four of your senses, which have used to guide you in your understanding of the world, are pretty much null and void at this point. So what happens then, right? What happens when a site that looks just like Wired gets put up, and there's a video of Zuckerberg saying, "I'm going to take over the world," or the CEO of TikTok saying, "We use all the information to undermine American democracy," and there are five different versions of that video, each one with different words. That's the part that becomes very interesting to me, is this multiplicity. We talk about the multiverse. We are in a multiverse, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
that we are there. Within a decade, we will live in a quote unquote contained universe that will have multiple versions of the reality around us, and it'll be up to us to pick in which version are we going to exist. And a lot of people will choose the one that isn't quote unquote the reality, right?
Which is fine if you know it is, right? If you know it's not the reality, but this question of who decides what the reality is, and so this is one area where I think there should be more government regulation. If anybody here is within the government, call me, call Carla. We'll get this is where you need to be, because
But that's not consistent, Dan, because you said that but you can't have it both ways. So why here and why not Uber? You didn't want to stifle innovation. Then why would you stifle innovation in AI?
because the scale and the potential harm is about a 10,000x. So, you're talking about regulating a particular industry and a particular segment of technology, and you're holding back, I think the evolution of society, and employment and things, to try to force organizations to continue operating like they did in the 50s, instead of evolving, which I think is a natural evolution. I think the issue with the AI side of things is that it's so pervasive, it's at such amazing scale, and there is absolutely no one that I know of that's actually really looking into this. And now you have this, if you watched any hero show as a kid, or comic book or whatever, one of the themes that always existed was there was some secret weapon or superpower, and the hero had to make sure that that superpower didn't end up in the hands of evil. They
Right.
only ended up in the hands of good. That's like one of the most central themes. This generative AI stuff is now the potential for that evil weapon, that weapon, that thing, to go in the hands of anybody, evil or not. It's democratized to a point where any Joe Schmo in a garage in any country, any bad actor, now has superpowers. And
That
there's
headline,
nobody stopping it.
that headline says it all, right? Because the one genie, I won't say put it back in the bottle, that we sort of kept in the bottle, was nuclear technology, right? What we saw it at work, I think the world just said, we're not going to keep developing this. This has to be contained, and it was done on an international sort of multilateral manner. It might take, that's the same kind of thing to say, look, we as a species just can't let this continue to develop, right, on its own without some safeguards. That's a very specialized conversation right now. It isn't in the mainstream, right? The
Yeah.
average person isn't worried about that. And I think that the AI creators are rushing to build what they can build, right? Just in the case that we do start having that conversation. If we do, I'll be shocked because as a society, we've like I said, besides nuclear power, I can't think of one thing when we said, okay, let's just stop innovating.
Look what happened. Look what happened. I don't know if this is a perfect example, but I'm hearing you say that. Think about how disruptive the WikiLeaks thing was.
Now,
So here's an example of some really basic technology that allowed one single person to evade government agencies and expose confidential information and then other information that people just didn't want to get out, right? That was one example of some really basic technology. Imagine that in the hands of everybody, and then not being able to authenticate whether it's even real or not. That's so to your point, right? There was this events of leaders in finance and industry, government, media in New York City last week. And the speakers, kind of pushed this kind of doom and gloom, presentation. And their claim is that, what nuclear weapons were to the physical world, AI is to the world that we live in now. And it's based on, all these things that we're talking about and the potential, damage. I think the other part of it is, and I think they mentioned this in this article in Wired as well, is, there's a lot of it's become a more common, understanding that, warfare, in today's day and age doesn't happen on a battlefield. It happens digitally, right? So a lot of the average person doesn't see what's happening behind the scenes, in the cybersecurity world. They get some news about hacks and things and their data being compromised, but they don't really realize how much U.S., Russia, cyber warfare is actually happening behind the scenes. I think the potential damage here is that this could be happening right underneath our noses without us realizing it.
well, we go back to leadership, right? To close out, right? We talk about leadership and digital transformation. I still think here is one where, as much as they've done, Microsoft, Google, Apple, others could be doing more, right? If they disagree with that assessment, right, that this is the digital nuclear weapon, fine, then say so and explain why you think this is hype or alarmism, whatever it happens to be. But if you don't, and you are that concerned, then why not be on the forefront? I mean, they certainly have the resources, right, Dan, to say, look, let's educate the populace and say, this is what we're building, why we're building it, what we think are the rules for how this stuff should work. In a way, the way the pharma companies have done in some cases, right, with setting up ethical boards. And my wife's a scientist and she works in medicine, and they're the what you have to do in this country to do something like a clinical trial, right? It's a remarkable process designed over decades to safeguard, right, the population against developing something incorrectly. So, is the answer then to say, look, let's take some parallel, right, of what we have in the drug industry and say that you can't do human trials with AI, right, without board review, without experimentation, without protocols, because the risk is that high.
And by the way, that's a perfect example of where it's a highly regulated industry and a highly innovative industry. So the
Right.
people that are out there saying that regulation kills innovation, in that example, it works, right? So why can't it work, in this environment? By the way, the guys that were at that event that mentioned that they use that term about the nuclear weapons, they're the same guys that were behind that Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. So
Right.
these guys predicted, all the issues we've talked about extensively with social media. They predicted that as well, and now they're talking about what they're calling now the AI dilemma. So yeah, listen, I'm all for tech. I'm all for innovation. I'm all for advancement, and I continue to choose tech over privacy. But there does have to be a limit at some point. Otherwise, to your point, the bad can outweigh the good at some point.
Well, it will take one very, very serious event, right, where AI does some amazing amount of damage, is some social construct, right? For us to finally have this conversation, we only hope that it's something that isn't that bad, but it's
I
probably.
wonder. I wonder. Is it going to be? Is it going to be an FTX moment where people wake up and say, you know, maybe we got to regulate this, or maybe we got to be more careful because everybody else adopted it and it seems safe because just because a couple celebrities endorsed it, it must be safe. Or will it be the kind of thing that's this sounds very dystopian, but the kind of thing that slowly unravels us over time without us knowing?
Well, I'll give you
That's
a
that's
scenario.
even scarier to me.
Well, I'll give you a scenario that right, we're 2 days before a presidential election. Video comes out of a candidate doing something terrible, and the election is within 24 hours. That video, which was AI generated, which it looks so real that the majors carry it, right? It's run as news. The election happens, and 48 hours later, we find out the whole thing was fake. Then what do you do?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Do you annul the election? Is it not? You go back and do it over again, right? That's not such a crazy scenario that we are within a decade of having some AI generated, right, completely artificial event tips a presidential election one way or the other, and then as a country we have to say, well, that whole election is null and void.
Or again, it happens underneath our so an AI
Right.
actually changes the results of the election and we don't realize it. So which is a lot of the conversation that happened in the last election that was not true.
Not true.
That came up. But what if it was? What if that really did happen and we didn't know because of this stuff happening under the hood?
I
So
think something like that, right? Then we are then in the same kind of, this is nuclear grade destruction, and we're gonna have to lock this down, take a big step backwards.
yeah,
So
yeah.
right, interesting times as always.
Was it light topics as always, Carlos? But fun. Listen, it's exciting stuff. I don't want to, we've talked a lot about the positives of it. So sorry for anybody watching who's now depressed, but I think it's just something we have to think about. In the sense, and if you're a leader, building this or thinking about, because every company in the world seems like they're now building ChatGPT or something similar into their system. So these are the things that we need to. It's going to reach. If you think the news about it has been, obsessive already, I mean, it's gonna bleed into every app you use, every piece of technology you have in your hand, your phone, the website you use. So we got to figure this out before it's too late. Sounds very dystopian, but it's true.
All right, one more week to think it over. I'll see you again next week, Dan.
Thanks, Carlos. Have a good week, everybody.
Bye bye.
Take care.